Right, let's take a look at the book of Micah. And most people agree, see what you think, that Micah is a contemporary of Isaiah. And in the first verse of the first chapter, we have the usual biographical detail. The word of the Lord that came to Micah. There's the name of the town in Judah, however you pronounce it, Moresheth, in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. So it's a prophet who prophesies both to Israel and to Judah. And quite nicely, the book divides into 3 sections. And I say nicely because each section begins with the same word. So if you look at chapter 1, verse 2, you get the word hear. Hear, all you peoples. Go across to chapter 3 and verse 1. Hear now, O heads of Jacob. And if you go over to chapter 6, verse 1, hear now what the Lord says. So that word hear divides the book up for us into 3 sections. So just to make it clear then, first section, chapter 1, verse 2, all the way through to the end of chapter 2. Second section is chapter 3, verse 1, and it includes chapter 4 and chapter 5. And then the third and final section, chapter 6, through to the end of chapter 7. So 3 neat divisions, and each of those sections contains a prophecy of doom, shall we say, of judgment, and there is then a mixture of hope. So the judgment is against Israel and Judah and Assyria. Assyria is going to be the great powerhouse, the great nation of the time, the great empire that will come against Israel. And so in Micah, like in many other prophets, God's judgment upon Israel will take the form of an invasion by Assyria, but God in turn then will judge Assyria. So there's those elements, and there's also elements of judgment against Jerusalem and Judah. But mixed in with that judgment, there will be hope, and the hope takes different forms each time. So let's take a closer look then. So if you look at the first section, chapter 1, verse 2, all the way through to the end of chapter 2, you get judgment against all the peoples. So chapter 1 and verse 2, arise. Sorry, I'm in the wrong chapter. There we go. Hear, all you peoples, listen, O earth, and all that is in it. So it begins with a judgment against the whole world, and we've noted that before with previous prophets. And then as you go down through the chapter, you get a narrowing down of the focus, and it becomes on Israel and on Judah. So in chapter 1, you see that as you go down into the chapter. So we then see in chapter 2, we have the same idea. And it's only when we get to verse 12 of chapter 2 that you get this notion of hope. So it's quite a lengthy section of judgment. And take a look at the hope, because hope is always better than judgment. Chapter 2, verse 12, I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob, and I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together like sheep of the fold, like a flock in the midst of their pasture. And that is one of the major images in the book of Micah. And it's the shepherd image. And we'll see that image again. So there's your first section then, ending with hope. We take a look at the third section, the second section, chapter 3 and verse 1. Hear now, O heads of Jacob, and you rulers of the house of Israel. Now, here judgment is being brought by Micah against the leadership, both of Israel and of Judah. It's a special focus on God's anger against the leadership. And we're going to see in this section something we've seen before. I think we saw it in Amos, and there was moments of it in Joel. And that's the idea of social injustice. the idea that God becomes more concerned about the welfare of his people than he is about temple observance and Sabbath observance and religious ritual. There's this movement now in Micah, it's in the prophets, of God's concern focusing on social equality and the care of one another. So chapter 3 is a judgment against the leaders because they fail to look after the poor. And if you look at the way that it's described, verse 3 of chapter 3, they eat the flesh of my people, flay their skin from them, break their bones, chop them in pieces, like meat for the pot, like flesh for the cauldron. It's very, very vivid imagery that's used against the leadership of both nations. Chapter 4 is a whole chapter of hope. And it's a wonderful chapter. It's one that talks about the future triumph and the reign of God from Jerusalem. So just take a look at the first verse of chapter 4. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted among the hills. It's this picture that we've seen before of God putting things right in the future. Zion is then the center of a new world that is put right. And the imagery is of the surrounding nations and peoples flowing into Zion, where they will meet God, where they will know God, and where they will then worship God. So you see it in Isaiah, you've seen it elsewhere. It's how God's purposes will focus on the temple and Zion in the way that he then will put everything right. So chapter 4 is this notion of hope and what that means for people. So verse 6, chapter 4, in that day, says the Lord, I will assemble the lame, I will gather the outcast, and those who I have afflicted, I will make the lame a remnant, and so on. It's this whole idea then of restoration. Chapter 4 is a wonderful chapter. In chapter 5, you've got a shepherd promise. So from verse 2 to verse 5, we have verses that should be familiar to us, and we're going to examine them at the end of our look at this book. So turn to chapter 5 and verse 2. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me one who will be ruler in Israel, whose going forth are from old, from everlasting. And if you look at verse 4, you've got the shepherd imagery again. He shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord, and they shall abide. They shall be like comfortable herds, if you like. So there's a messianic shepherd promise that is part of the hope that we see in chapter 4 and then extending into chapter 5. And there will also then be a note in chapter 5 of how hope will mean the judgment of God on the enemies of God. So Assyria will be the nation that will come against Israel and destroy Israel. But if you take a look at chapter 5 and halfway through verse 5, there is this hope against the Assyrians. When the Assyrians comes into our land, when he treads in our palaces, then we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 princely men. They shall waste with the sword the land of Assyria. So it's a really interesting idea there of how shepherd means comfort and security and feeding and safety for the people of God. But shepherd will also mean judgment against the enemies of God. And that's a very striking image. And that then extends into the rest of chapter 5. Take a look at the third section then, chapter 6. And what you have in chapter 6, in the first 8 verses, is what's known as a covenant lawsuit. It's the idea of God taking his people to court to find them guilty. And we've had moments of covenant lawsuits in previous prophets. It's the idea of the imagery and the language of a trial being employed by God, and the charge, the accusation against Israel is that they have broken the covenant. So if you take a look at chapter 6, and we can see the idea there in verse 1. Arise, plead your case before the mountain. So there's the legal case, and the pleading is the idea of coming to court and giving voice to your complaint. And the idea there that it's creation itself who will hear, the mountains will hear the complaint that God has against his people. And you see it in verse 2, hear, O you mountains, the Lord's complaint, and you strong foundations of the earth, for the Lord has a complaint against his people, and he will contend with Israel. Now that's legal language. It's not a complaint as in a moan or a grumble. It's a legal action. So it's all set in the courtroom. And what God does is he lays out the grounds for his complaint. So his complaint is unfaithfulness. So really what you've got here, which didn't exist at the time really, but you've got the idea of the divorce court, that a husband goes to court against his wife, seeking a divorce, and the grounds are adultery. So if you take a look at verse 3, O my people, what have I done to you? And how have I wearied you? Testify, a legal term, testify against you, and here's the history. I brought you up from the land of Egypt. I redeemed you from the house of bondage. I sent before you Moses and Aaron and Miriam and so on, okay? So here's the grounds for the complaint. And what then happens following this complaint is you get punishment. You get the result. And so you go down to verse 9, down to verse 16, and it's the result, it's the action, it's the judgment of the court. Now, it's very interesting, very unusual. I said there's bits of this before. You see elements of it. You may remember in the book of Job, we have a reversal of the covenant complaint. God is in the dock in the book of Job, and God is taken to court by Job because Job thinks God has broken his side of the covenant. So you have that with Job as the person initiating the legal action in the book of Job. But here in Micah, the more familiar idea of God as the wronged person going to court to get judgment against the unfaithfulness of his people. We've got chapter 7. We'll talk about chapter 7 in a moment or two. It's an interesting chapter because we see something that we've seen before, and I'll just mention that in a second. But the book ends with this note of hope. So remember now, it's judgment and then it's hope. Each of the sections has judgment and hope. So the hope at the end of chapter 7 is again the return of the shepherd motif. So you see it in the sections that deal with hope. Hope centers around the person who is the shepherd. So take a look. Chapter 7 and verse 14. Shepherd your people with your staff, the flock of your heritage, who dwell lonely in a woodland in the midst of Carmel. And verse 16, the nations shall see and be ashamed of all their might. And then you go down into verse 20, you will give truth to Jacob and mercy to Abraham, which you have sworn to our fathers from days of old. So shepherd imagery, the dealing of sins, the forgetting of sins in the sea, and the restoration of the people of God. So do you get the idea? Now that's the structure. What I want to do is pick up some of the themes, and there are a number of them. And I was a bit vague a moment ago about chapter 7. And the reason is I was waiting to talk to you about the themes, because one of the themes of Micah is the idea of a lament. Now, how many times have we seen laments in the Old Testament? We've already referred to Job, and you have laments in the book of Job. You have laments in the Psalms. You have an entire lament in the book of Lamentations, of course. You have laments scattered in Jeremiah and others. So let's take a look at the laments in the book of Micah. The first lament is chapter 1, and it's from verse 8 down to verse 16. And the I, people think, is Micah himself. So take a look, Micah 1 and verse 8. Therefore I will wail and howl, I will go stripped and naked, I will make a wailing like the jackals and a mourning like the ostriches. So here is Micah lamenting because God is going to move in action against Israel and against Judah. And then, of course, go to chapter 7, and there is lament number 2. So in chapter 7, you have verse 8 down to verse perhaps 11 or 12, a second lament. Do not rejoice over me, my enemy. When I fall, I will arise. When I sit in darkness, the Lord will be a light to me. So remember the idea of a lament. A lament is an expression of suffering directed to God, and it's a outpouring of grief to God. It's a prayer, but it also has elements of confidence and hope. So a lament is unusual because it's a place where you can give free rein and free voice to your anger and to your despair and to your sense of injustice, and you can direct all that against God, and you can hold God responsible, if you like. It's God's actions that have made you lament, but it's perfectly fine. There is no idea that it's somehow unspiritual or sinful to give voice to anger and grief. It's fine, but you've got this sense of addressing God in your despair, even holding him responsible, but they will be running through it notions of confession and of hope. So there's 2 laments in the book of Micah. There is also in the first chapter a theophany. Do you remember the idea of theophany? We've seen it time and time and time again in the Old Testament. A theophany is a theos, God, phaneo or epiphany, and appearing. It's the idea either in physical form or the declaration that God will come and visit and arise and descend and act. It's the action of God described in visible human form. So take a look at chapter 1 and verses 3 to 4. For behold, the Lord is coming out of his place. He will come down and tread on the high places of the earth. The mountains will melt out under him. The valleys will split like wax before him, like water poured down a steep place. Now, it's primarily the coming of God as a person to judge Israel and Judah. But there are elements there, as you would expect now in the prophets, there are elements that look forward to the day of the Lord, to that future moment. So there's elements here of the second coming of Christ, when he will come in his glory at the sound of a trumpet. It's a kind of hint there in that theophany. So you've got laments, you've got theophanies, and as we've seen, we've also got the shepherd imagery. Let's take a look then at the one that is most well known, chapter 5 and verse 2. Now, what I want to open up later on is a discussion of how Micah is used in the New Testament. And there are 2 occasions when Micah is quoted, and they are in the book of Matthew. And this verse, verse 2, is referred to by the scribes when Herod inquires of them where the Messiah is to be born. So do you remember the wise men from the east have arrived in Jerusalem? They followed the star. They're asking, where is he who is born King of the Jews? Herod draws his own wise men to him, asks them the question, and they find the answer here in this verse. So take a look at it again. Micah 5 and verse 2. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one who is the ruler of Israel. Let's take a look at that then. Keep your fingers there and go across to Matthew and chapter 2. Let's find it then in Matthew's birth narratives, chapter 2, and we'll see how it's quoted. So Matthew 2, verse 5, they said to him, that's the scribes and the chief priests, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Now, when you look at the way New Testament quotes the Old Testament, you have a whole series of questions to ask, and you have a whole meaning given to you in order to understand the New Testament passages. So notice the differences between the way Matthew quotes Micah 5 verse 2 and what you actually find when you read Matthew 5 verse 2. What are those differences and what do they tell us? And what Matthew does particularly is he takes this theme of shepherd that we've noticed in Micah, and he translates his verse in the context of a shepherd, whereas what you may have had in your Old Testament reference is the ruler. So notice things like that. There's a second quote in Matthew from the book of Micah. So if you turn back to Micah and chapter 7 this time, we'll read the verse and you will immediately recognize it from Matthew's gospel. So Micah 7 and verse 6. Micah 7 verse 6, for son dishonors father, daughter rises against her mother, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies are the men of his own household. Now, again, do the usual, finger there, and then go across to Matthew and chapter 10. So Jesus this time quotes from Micah. And in Matthew 10, verses 34 to 39, okay? Matthew 10 this time, 34 to 39. Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come, and here's the quote, to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it. Now, what I want us to discuss once we've completed looking at the book of Micah is, what does that verse mean from Micah 7? And how does Jesus use it? And is he using this verse to raise the fact that Jesus causes divisions in family life? Is that the whole thrust of what Micah is talking about, and then what Jesus refers to? And so for many people, it's the idea that in a family, you'll have one who's a Christian and one who isn't. And so that one who is a Christian could be a father or a mother or a father-in-law or a mother-in-law. And the one who is not a Christian could be the son or the daughter or the daughter-in-law or the son-in-law. And so because one is allied with Christ and another isn't, then you have division. And so what many people think is that Jesus is making it very clear in Matthew 10 that he has come in order to divide. And the imagery of a sword is used for its cutting action. So families will be cut by the sword of the person of Christ, and there will be separations within family life. And so for some people who think that's what it means, they would then go a step further and say, unless you're willing to know such divisions, then you are not worthy of Jesus. If you're not willing to be divided from your non-Christian loved ones and to embrace the separation and to put your loyalty to Christ rather than your loyalty to a non-Christian husband or a non-Christian daughter, unless you're willing to do that, then you are not worthy of Jesus. And unless you're willing to embrace such a division, then you are saving your life. And those who save their lives will eventually lose them. But if you are willing to embrace that costly division and remain loyal to Jesus and put him above your loyalty to a son or a daughter, then you are going to lose your life because that's very painful, but you'll ultimately save it. Now, is that what's going on here? Because that's what many people think. And you may be working out from the tone of my voice, is that's not what I think is going on here. You think what you like, but it's not what I think. And what I would like us to do is to open it up for discussion once we've completed our look at this book. So is it division or is it something else? Okay, then. So you've got these themes of lament and the courtroom and God appearing amongst us. And you have notions of hope and the shepherd. And one other thing just to, I guess, finish with is just to note again how often the imagery of shepherd will occur in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And so Micah is one of the prophets who adds to our understanding of the shepherd imagery, or the way that God identifies himself as our shepherd and his people as his sheep. So one final look at Micah 5 and verse 2. And take a look at it again. I won't read it again, but what do we learn about the nature of the shepherd when you look at this verse? So what tends to happen is each prophet or each author in scripture adds a little bit to the big picture. So if you take the big picture of the shepherd imagery, Micah's adding a new little part of the mosaic, if you like. What is he telling us? Well, he's telling us, I think, two things that we may not have seen before. He's telling us about the origins of the shepherd, that the shepherd will come from Bethlehem. But he's also telling us about the nature of the shepherd. So you've got origins and you've got nature. And when it comes to the origins of the shepherd, it's the idea that the shepherd will arise from a place of obscurity. The place that is the least of all in Judah. And just think of how often that idea has been presented to us, not in terms of the shepherd now, but just in general terms, how somebody comes from the least important place, the least significant place. And one who comes to mind is David. And David was brought from somewhere that was of the least significance. And of course, there's a David link here. And if you then take that forward into the New Testament, you see that Jesus has his origins, not just in Bethlehem, but also in Nazareth. And the idea continues and is fulfilled in Jesus, that he comes from somewhere that is despised, somewhere of least importance, somewhere of obscurity. He comes from the outside places. And that's what's being indicated here in Micah 5 verse 2. And then in the nature of the shepherd, look at the end of the verse, whose going forth are from of old, from everlasting. And the idea there is that the shepherd is an eternal shepherd. The idea of eternity very often amongst the prophets is found in the language of time. He is of old. He is the ancient. And you can think of this in Daniel, you can think of it in Ezekiel, the idea of eternity framed by reference to the past. And that's another example here. So the shepherd is both humble and from a place of obscurity, but is also eternal and established and recognized. And so you can almost see there, can't you, that the two natures, can we say, in the great shepherd in John 10, from Bethlehem, from Nazareth, in human form, taking on nature, the lowly and the humble, but he is also God from everlasting, the one who is the very image of God. Both of these are found here in Micah 5 and verse 2. So take away from Micah the shepherd imagery. And that's the imagery that I guess will be most positive for us. There's the day of the Lord, there's future restoration, there's God putting everything right, and it's all through the person of the shepherd. So that's the book of Micah.